Hello, and welcome to Book Circle Presents An Ever-Mounted Cavalry. I'm Earl Weinberg. Our protagonists are listening to a sometime spy, a Mr. Limney, who is describing the end of the Fitzmichael family by blackmail to force them to accept transformation into centaurs, all of the males, even the little boy. Dr. Bayard left with Limney. "What is this about?" he demanded in an undertone as soon as they were out of the library. Limney told him. Bayard groaned. "All this to cover up Dominic's sin and folly," he lamented. "Hugh creates a whole new military, and Leon bows to blackmailers and ends his line, all to prevent the fury that would erupt if this were known. And Leon is right. Gerald is safe as changed. And Elaine is right. This could kill Grand Normandy. But," he growled, "Elaine seems to forget that blackmailers necessarily make enemies. And here he has made himself into a soldier in the midst of a war. So many chances, so many people who hate him now." "Including two he does not know about," Limney pointed out. "Quite true." "Well, is it true? How can Elaine and Leon and the rest not realize we know?" "They are not thinking about us," Limney answered. "They took a little care to say nothing openly before us. We have said nothing openly, and they are very, very preoccupied." Bayard sighed and nodded. "What do we tell the boy?" Limney asked. Dr. Bayard paced a few steps silently, thinking, then said, "We tell him about their changes and his change, because otherwise we deceive by silence and make the shock of it worse. For his safety, we say nothing political. Nothing about anyone doing bad things, about enemies. Certainly not that Elaine and his men are enemies." Limney nodded. "He's been chattering about the new cavalry for days, like everyone else. He's even been pretending to be. He might even want to. Do we try to make it sound jolly, fun? I'm not sure I can." Bayard shook his head. "If he wants to be happy, let him be happy. But I'm not sure I can put that face on it." The Honorable Gerald Fitzmichael was in his schoolroom, listening to his tutor lecture on French history. Limney wondered in alarm what he dared say in front of the tutor, but this was no problem for Bayard. "Mr. Riston," he told the man, "we must speak to Gerald privately. Please excuse us." Riston opened his mouth to ask something, met Bayard's moveless stare, then just nodded and left. Gerald looked at the two men in alarm. "Is something wrong?" he asked. "Gerald," said Bayard, "your father and your uncle the Duke and all the other men of your family—" He took a breath and reviewed his words one last time. He kept face and voice calm. "Have decided to join the new cavalry." Gerald gazed at him open-mouthed. "You mean they're to become horsemen? Centaurs?" "Yes, they have already been changed. And you are going with them. You are to be changed too." "He cheered," said Limney, looking at the floor, "hopped around the room waving his arms. I remember thinking he won't be able to hop in a few minutes." Bayard just stared, white-faced, and didn't say any more. "As soon as I could, I told the boy they're waiting for you in the back garden, and he was off like a shot. We ran after him and got to the back garden just in time to see him finish shucking his clothes. The moment he stood up straight, Elaine shot him. And that was it, the end of the Fitzmichael line. The boy fell over and thrashed and stretched and changed and got up laughing. Laughing. His father and the Duke and all the others were there in their torn and shot-up shirts, and Lady Amber, his mother, and the Duchess, not Lady Anne or her horse. I never saw such acting in my life. As soon as he lifted his head, they all smiled. But I saw their faces just before. Then he staggered over to his mom and dad, and they hugged him, and his mother could cry then. And he couldn't see their faces. Well, after a bit, I offered to pack for them, but Elaine said it wasn't necessary. And it turns out he had a caravan of horse trailers down the road. Herded them all in, and they rolled away, leaving the women to weep. Limney seemed to run down then and stared silently at the floor. Brother Eugene said, "He does hop still." Ivy blinked, then said, "Gerald, you've seen him?" "Of course. All the Grand Norman centaurs are in Upham at present, except for Prince Hugh and me, I suppose. There aren't such a huge number of them, and it's a small town. The one little boy centaur stands out. He hops about like a bounding deer, very earnest, very inquisitive, anxious to help and learn. He's still happy. That may last until his family is sent into action. Then there will be worry and, like as not, grief. But that's the same as for any child with family in the military." His eyes met Ivy's. She nodded, but asked, "Isn't he too young to be in the army? Cavalry?" "He's 8. He's a cadet. Runs errands and takes lessons and will be kept well away from the front." "Still," Brother Eugene shrugged helplessly, "what were we to do with him? He showed up with all his male family already centaurized. You may be sure there was a lot of tut-tutting when we saw him, but the Upham Cavalry Base is the only place we have for centaurs, and we barely have that. It's still being reorganized to accommodate 2 very distinct cavalries. There, he is safe and fits in as well as he can anywhere." "What about all the adult Fitzmichaels and Elaine and his men?" Fletcher asked. "I didn't particularly mark them," Eugene said, not knowing this story. "Pretty quiet, I think, both groups. Certainly neither draws a lot of attention to itself." Fletcher nodded. "And Elaine and company are stuck in a military base with their victims, where men practice for violence, and there are lots of guns and things." "Why did Elaine and his men change themselves?" Ivy asked. "Do you know?" she asked Limney. Limney shook his head. "I've wondered too." Fletcher leaned back in his chair and considered the ceiling. Well. Hard to find out without destroying the secrecy Prince Hugh clearly wants to preserve. But just as clearly, Hugh did not want revenge taken on the Fitzmichaels, not even on Dominic. At least, not yet. And Elaine disobeyed, flagrantly. He would expect to be punished. What punishment do you think he would expect? Anyone? "To be made to change and join the cavalry," Brother Eugene answered. Fletcher nodded. "Perhaps he means to show the prince, 'I accept your authority so completely, I will take your punishment voluntarily.' That's a fanatic's sort of gesture." "Perhaps," agreed Miss Blackholt, "but if I were Prince Hugh, it would make me livid. Elaine is a great admirer of the prince, but he is going to manage the relationship, not do anything so common as obey." Fletcher nodded again. "We, on the other hand, should obey. We must help Prince Hugh keep his secret." He bowed his head in thought. Everyone gave him silence. After a minute, he lifted his head. "First step, we take vows of secrecy, all of us here. Ivy, you don't have a name geas, so you can't take a vow with magical force, but will you promise? And agree to take the geas and the vow later when they can be arranged?" After a few seconds, Ivy said, "Yes, you're my friends. I don't want to see your country hurt. And you're on our side against the Nazis. Hurting Grand Normandy hurts Britain and the Allies, so yes." She was sitting down, but still felt a little dizzy. Grand Normans, it appeared, really did treat 14-year-olds as grown-ups. "Thank you," said Fletcher. "Wait," said Miss Blackholt. "It's well enough to promise not to volunteer anything about this, but do we swear not to reveal it to anyone ever? What if a superior officer wants to know about it?" "We tell them that this is a crown secret," Fletcher answered, "and we can swear to that. We tell them we can only answer on authorization from the Queen, the Prince, General Fitzsimmons, or Dr. Blackholt." He looked at Limney. "That is what we will tell the people coming here to pick you up, too. I think the result will be that they take you to Fitzsimmons, who will have you examined to verify what you've told us and squeeze what else he can out of you." He smiled grimly. It will be interesting to see what he makes of the Fitzmichaels and Elaine after that. He rose. "Now back to the phone at the pub. I must try to reach Bayard at the Fitzmichael house to coach him with the same oath." As he headed out the door, Limney called, "Sir, wait!" He held up the leather pouch slung at his side. "I really am a courier, after all. I have messages for you and Lieutenant Blackholt." Fletcher held out his hand. Limney pulled a letter out of the bag and gave it to him. "Just stay put," said Fletcher, and left. Limney obediently stayed, sat, and sipped tea. Everyone in the room looked at him, even the bees gathered round the silver spoon. Finally, he asked Miss Blackholt, "What do you think they will do with me, Lieutenant?" She looked him over judiciously. "You have disobeyed general orders and flouted security regulations in service to the Fitzmichaels, who are rich and powerful despite their situation, but were a traditional thorn in the side of the crown, and so have enemies as well as friends. Given that, the chain of command would almost certainly jail you, maybe even shoot you if they were in a ferocious mood, possibly get imaginative with curses, or hand you over to fays." She glanced at Melissa, whose expression did not change. "But the chain of command won't ever know. You are very likely to come to the attention of the authorities Lieutenant Fletcher named, the Queen, the Prince, General Fitzsimmons, and my uncle. They will see things differently. You were working against Elaine, who must surely be their least favorite ally. After all, they must know all the tale you told us. Elaine and his close friends disappear along with a brace of enchanted arrows, then show up at Upham, transformed, and with all the Fitzmichael men in tow, transformed and so neutralized. If Elaine didn't confess outright, or boast, to Prince Hugh, I would wager he did. I rather think they will wind up giving you to Fitzsimmons, running errands for him, tied up rather tightly in oaths and promises. But maybe working with your Fitzmichaels again. You might even like it. The General appreciates loyalty." "How would you feel," she asked, "if the General told you to get up on hooves, as they're now saying? I'm not saying he will, I just wonder." Limney's eyes widened. "I don't know. I have very mixed emotions about the idea." "Well, you will probably be more useful as a two-legged courier and liaison than as one more pony boy." She sipped her tea, contemplated Limney a little more, then stared over his shoulder out the window. "What happens to the Fitzmichaels now?" asked Ivy. "I mean, I know the men all serve in the cavalry, but what about the women? And what happens after the war, in the long run, if we win?" "Anne Fitzmichael has a horse she must stay with," Miss Blackholt answered. "We've no idea how to alter that. If we can reverse the transformation, everything can be undone, and the women get their men back as men, those who survive. Otherwise, there will simply be no more Fitzmichael sons. But these dynastic issues do not look so bleak from a female perspective. Heirs do not have to be male, though it's usual. There have been duchesses and baronesses and such in their own right, and in some of the houses the head is elected, as is the monarch. Each has its own custom. The Fitzmichael custom was male primogeniture, and as things stand now, there won't be any Fitzmichael children of either sex. But when the kingdom was buzzing with the news that all the Fitzmichael men had sacrificed themselves for the war effort, Queen Ruth pressed the lords, hard and publicly, for a favor. In the event that Duke Leon dies without human issue, the duchy should pass to his wife and her line, then to be styled the Dalton Fitzmichaels. Dalton was her maiden name. So she got her way. "So she must not hate the Fitzmichaels," Ivy observed. "Oh, I'm sure she'd like to render Dominic Fitzmichael down into glue for what he did to her son. But no, she doesn't hate the others." Makes her look better, too, said Melissa. She smiled at Ivy's puzzled expression. The Fitzmichael change would make people suspect the royal family pushed them into it somehow to get rid of them. Helping their succession counters that, some. So it didn't make any difference, said Ivy. I mean, it's awful what Dominic did to the prince and what Elaine did to the Fitzmichaels, but in the long run the Fitzmichaels go on as before. Brother Eugene shook his head. Not entirely. The Dalton Fitzmichaels would be the creatures of the crown. Their title would be a royal gift. Makes no difference on paper, but it will in other ways. Ivy sighed and recalled her parents had sometimes said sarcastic things about people with titles. But she could not remember the remarks, and now did not seem the time to try. There was more quiet, and Ivy wondered how Lieutenant Fletcher was getting on. Are all your messages for Lieutenant Fletcher? Miss Blackholt asked Limney, or are there any for me? He pulled out an envelope. This one is addressed to the Oswick Majory Field Lab, he said, so it's to you both, but I suppose mainly to you. He handed it over. Miss Blackholt opened and read. Her face went blank. When she spoke, it was in a rapid mutter, half annoyed, half wondering. So he did it. I wondered. I laid bets to myself. She looked up at the others. My uncle has given in to the family curse. Ivy looked at Mr. Limney, then Melissa, and for good measure the other bee fairies. No one offered comment or explanation. What is the family curse? She asked Miss Blackholt. Family tradition has it that sometime in the 1500s— Wait a moment, Ivy decided it was time to make another list. She pulled out her notebook and wrote, Things that turn out to be real. Centaurs, magic enchanters, fairies, werewolves, hidden nations, curses. Family tradition? She prompted. Back then, a young Blackholt man went for a moonlight walk with his sweetheart, and they came across a troop of fairies having a revel on a hill, a fairy mound. They watched a bit, then started to withdraw, but the fays came streaming off the mound and swept them up in a procession to a meadow at the other end of the country. Then they vanished away, but young Blackholt found his girl had vanished too. Well, we were a sundered family even then, so he went to another fay he knew, a friend, and asked for help. This fay gave him a shapeskin, the same idea as the seaming cloth Lieutenant Fletcher used, to take the form of a weasel, and directions for sneaking into the fairy mound. He took with him a second skin, and he and his sweetheart escaped in the form of weasels. But just as they left the mound, still in the shapeskins, the Fey Lord caught up with them, the one who ruled the mound and had taken the girl. And the Fey said, Since you are so fond of changes and shifts and disguises, your family shall never be quit of them. Ever since then, the Blackholts have gone on from strength to strength in magical talent, but we seldom stray from glamour and seemings and magical disguises as our main interest. And in every generation, one or more of us changes, goes off to join the Fays, or is taken by them, or becomes a satyr or one of the merfolk, or runs afoul of a Fay or genie or the like, and is transformed outright. And usually it is voluntary. Now, your uncle's turned himself into a centaur, Ivy guessed. She added satyr, merfolk, and genie to her list of things that turn out to be real. Miss Blackholt sighed. It was not a sad sigh or a resigned one. It was exasperated, almost a snort. Yes, in the cause of research, of course, she announced in an undeceived tone, as if quoting a tipsy uncle claiming the brandy had been medicinal. Ivy wondered if she had wanted to change, but the magic arrows didn't work on women. Miss Blackholt read a little more in her uncle's letter. It was a pretty little trick. As I think we said, mortal magic cannot reach to true shape-shifting, so there must be something beyond mortal in the spells for the arrows. My uncle narrowed it down to arrowheads. They are made of hoof trimmings, hoof from some fey breed of horse, or a fey in horse form, or something of the sort, with a trace of fairy vis still in them. He believed he had worked out all the rest of the spell, very like the spell on the seaming cloth, with the addition of the part that leverages the fairy horse magic. To test it, well, I must give him credit for bravery, or being around so many transformed men made the fascination unbearable. Among all the arrows scavenged, some were broken, the spell destroyed. So he made his own, using the head from a dispelled arrow, working up the whole spell, a major piece of magic, I assure you, and stabbed himself with it. She pulled a photograph out of the envelope and studied it. He says that in good conscience he could not test it on anyone else. Suppose I must give him that. She handed the photo to Ivy. Ivy saw, of course, a centaur. He stood in some big empty room, a barn or stable. The horse body was black. The human part wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, had black hair and a long bony face, and could readily be a close relative of Miss Blackhold. He held a 2-meter ruler upright in one hand so you could see how tall he was, or at least that he was more than 2 meters tall. He did not smile. His jaws were clamped and his mouth was tight. He was unshaven, his hair was rumpled, and he had circles under his eyes. Clearly he had been working long and hard. But those eyes burned. It was brave, Miss Blackhold conceded, or reckless. If it had gone wrong, he could simply have turned into a horse, or ended up with a horse's head, or some other mix-up not so workable as a centaur. Hooves for hands. Or suppose there had been no mass increase, a miniature centaur. Anything. Well, she perused the letter. He gives me the seaming cloth outright. Very nice. The mollification in her voice sounded slight, but genuine. I think it's government property, but if he doesn't want it back, no one else is likely to. Ivy wondered if she had tried it out. Ivy had very little money, but she felt willing to bet that her hostess had tried the seaming cloth. He has resigned his post as court wizard to become the chief magic officer of the new dedicated cavalry. A step down, technically, but there can be a cachet to doing it because you want to. So there will have to be... Oh. She paused and reread. There will have to be a new court wizard, of course, and he's recommended me. She blushed and sounded choked up. Do you need to get elected? Ivy asked. No, the monarch appoints the post. Of course, Queen Ruth would take advice from her cabinet, but in this case the relevant cabinet member is Uncle Edward. She raised the letter just in case it wasn't clear who Uncle Edward was. So it's a cert, Ivy concluded. Pretty much, yes. Congratulations, said Brother Eugene. Ivy, Limney, and Melissa echoed him. The bees by the spoon raised their wings. Thank you, she went on reading. More immediately, he points out we need a steady supply of these special hoof trimmings if we're to make our own magical arrows. Just then, Lieutenant Fletcher came back in. He surveyed their faces, focused on Miss Blackhold, and grinned. Congratulations, Your Excellency. She smiled back a little nervously. Let us not be premature, but thank you. He waved away her caution. It's a cert, he said, unconsciously echoing Ivy. You and the court wizard are working on the two most important magic problems facing the nation, how to turn men into centaurs and back. The court wizard moves on and wants you to succeed him. What else will happen? The Blackholts don't have any enemies at court, do they? No. In academia, yes, but not at court. Was all that in your letter? Yes, he turned to Limney. I got through to Bayard, and for a wonder to General Fitzsimmons, who already knew a fair bit about it. There's a gremlin in the works who deserves a commendation for getting the calls through so fast, especially Fitzsimmons. I can't say he's happy with you, but he does appreciate that you and Bayard have been keeping the secrets properly secret. You're to go on with it. You and Bayard will be debriefing to him soon. At length. told you," Miss Blackgold said to Limney. "You aren't even under arrest," Fletcher told him, "at least not so far, though I expect you'll be on a short rein. Beats being shot, though, doesn't it?" "Yes, sir," said Limney softly. "Your escort will be here soon. They're not to discuss matters with you, nor you with them." "Of course not, sir." Fletcher turned to Ivy. "A Father Neil is coming, too. He's a Vanguard chaplain. Such chaplains don't have a lot to do with sermons and Sunday schools, more with oaths and exorcisms. But they do take confession. He's coming to administer the guias for you, Ivy, so you can take a secrecy oath with the rest of us." "Still willing?" Ivy sat up straight. "Yes, nothing's changed since you went to the pub." He smiled. "Not in some ways, but your oath's one step closer now that the Vanguard's on its way. I thought it might make things feel realer." "Well, yes, I suppose so, but that's no reason to back out." Now he did not smile. "Thank you." Ivy nodded. She felt a little glow of satisfaction and tried to balance it against the feeling of entangling confusion and danger that had built while Limney was telling his tale. She also wondered what her Grand Norman friends would have done if she had not been willing to promise secrecy. Well, it didn't matter now. What does matter now is what to do next, and we'll find out about that next time.